Hi, so I'm Rachel Aldred and I'm going to be talking about some of the findings from an Outer London survey that I led over 6 waves, which was called People and Places, and looked at the impacts of active travel infrastructure on travel behaviour and attitudes. So the intervention that we were initially attempting to evaluate the programme was called the mini-Hollands programme. So in 2013, there was a document produced in London called the Mayor's Vision for Cycling, which laid out a number of new projects, a number of schemes, a number of ideas that were going to be put in place across London. So one of these, one of the 3 main planks of this actually was an Outer London mini-Hollands programme. So the idea was that 3 Outer London boroughs would win a share of £100 million pot, which would be used to create active travel infrastructure and create a step change in those Outer London boroughs. So I was quite excited when I heard about this, because it wasn't, central London, it was Outer London, it was residential areas where increasingly most Londoners are spending a lot of their time. So I thought, if this makes a difference, this could be really quite important for people beyond, transforming central areas, beyond, flagship routes in the central districts. Also, because I thought potentially these Outer London schemes, the results could be more transferable, more generalisable to other parts of the UK, other metropolitan parts of the UK and beyond, in fact, because when you look at, this is from 2018 to 19 TfL data, travel survey data, when you look at the mode share of residence trips and you compare inner and Outer London, there's really large differences. And Outer London is much more car dependent, it's got more than double the mode share for private motorised transport compared to inner London. It's more typical of other metropolitan parts of the UK. It's got very low levels of cycling. Inner London is like 4% mode share, but Outer London is several times lower than that, even less walking, less use of public transport. So, really more challenging context for these schemes than Inner London potentially. So these are the 3 winners that were announced in 2014 for receiving this kind of 5 to 6 year funding over 5 or 6 years, funding around £33 million each. Which, in the scheme of things, compared to big road schemes, isn't that much, but compared to typical funding for walking and cycling is quite a lot more than one's used to. So there's Enfield and Waltham Forest in the north of Outer London, and Kingston in the southwest. Now, it's worth pointing out that these did have somewhat different travel patterns at baseline. So Waltham Forest was more close to the Outer London average in terms of active travel. Kingston had relatively high levels of cycling, although still, a long way away from being Dutch, but higher than typical in Outer London. And Enfield had, lower even than the average levels of cycling in Outer London. So, not this isn't Camden or Hackney. This is Outer London, 3 Outer London boroughs. And so the People and Places survey, which has been funded by Transport for London over a 5-year period, led by Westminster University, was an attempt to use this programme as a kind of natural experiment. So basically, it's not an experiment in terms of randomisation, obviously, but in terms of us being able to select control sites, being able to have a controlled comparison, that's the approach that we took. And so, as I was saying, we were examining whether and how proximity to mini-Holland interventions, this kind of set of active travel schemes, was associated with change in travel behaviour and attitudes, and change in attitudes to the local environment. The findings I'm going to present in a moment actually separate different types of interventions. So we got a couple of years ago, there started to be a great deal of interest in what became called low traffic neighbourhoods. So area level schemes that remove all or most of the through motor traffic from usually a set of contiguous residential streets generally. But what we thought was that we could actually use this survey to look at the impact of low traffic neighbourhoods in particular as well, because one of our boroughs, Waltham Forest, had basically done a lot of low traffic neighbourhoods, although they weren't called that then. Our research questions then kind of are in 3 groups. So firstly, whether mini-Holland interventions are associated with change in levels of cycling, walking and car use. So obviously Transport for London was hoping to see more cycling and walking and less car use. Secondly, are they associated with change in perceptions of local environmental quality? So around sort of perceptions of the cycling environment, the walking environment and the wider environment more generally. And finally, are they associated with change in attitudes towards different transport modes? So we were particularly interested in looking at attitudes as well as behaviour, because one of the things that we thought was, you know, you don't necessarily get a change straight away in travel behaviour, particularly where places are relatively car dependent. Maybe what will happen is we'll get a change in attitudes first and then a change in behaviour. So this was an online survey. It's the first, the baseline wave was in 2016, and we offered both a baseline. We offered online and phone options, but most people chose online, and the people who chose the phone option were willing to fill it in online in future. So it ended up being an online only survey. We had basically a sample made up of two main groups. We did some household leafleting. We recruited some people that way, but not as many as I would have liked. So we also used the Transport for London customer database, people who signed up for information about TfL related stuff. So we had those people as well. And we went back to the same people year on year. So the online survey consisted of different aspects. So firstly, there's a week travel diary. So this is quite important because we could look at any use of different modes over the past week, not just a single day, but a whole week. We also asked more detailed questions about time spent each day walking, cycling, or in a car or van. So as you can imagine, there was sort of toing and froing about how best to record this. And in the end, particularly as we're interested in all walking and cycling, not only specific trips to specific places, we went for a time-based measure, which obviously has pluses and minuses. We had some supplementary travel behaviour questions, which we cut down slightly after the baseline wave, trying to make the survey more manageable, but they included stuff like, you know, if somebody hadn't cycled in the past week, did they cycle in the past month or past year, were they able to cycle? Thirdly, we had some questions on perceptions of the local environment. As I just mentioned, you know, these were derived from Healthy Streets domains, which TfL was developing an approach to categorise the extent to which streets promote health, promote healthy travel behaviour, and so on. So we had TfL has now developed its own instruments further around this, but at the time hadn't so much. So we developed questions based on this. We use where possible already validated survey questions around things like you know, presence of safe crossings. We had questions on preferences for using different modes of transport, trying to look at particularly suppressed demand, and views on investment or support for different modes, which I haven't really got time to talk about in this presentation, but the results were quite interesting. I'll just touch on them very briefly at the end. And finally, demographic questions. We wanted to be able to look if there were differences, you know, were there differences by gender, by age group, and so on. But unfortunately, we didn't have the survey power really to confidently answer the questions around that. So we didn't generally find differences by demographic group, but I think the differences would have generally had to be quite large for us to be powered to detect them. And as a natural experiment approach, we were taking a difference in differences approach and analysis. So we were looking at the change in the control group, comparing that to change in intervention groups to isolate the impact of an intervention. So, you know, for instance, like today is a really lovely spring day in London. There's a lot more people out and about walking. So, you know, if you don't have a control group, you can't really be sure that your intervention, that a change is not due to better weather. But, you know, by comparing the control and intervention group, we can hopefully isolate the impact of the intervention. This became particularly important as well in COVID times, which also introduced more noise into the survey, of course. So before I present some results, I just wanted to give you a flavour of some of the local environment questions that we were asking and their results. So these are a set of 15 questions that we developed that were part of the survey. We also we asked them in terms of a Likert scale, so from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And here you can see on the right the sample mean at baseline, where strongly agree is 2, agree is 1, neither agree nor disagree is 0, disagree is -1, strongly disagree is -2. So this is just the average. And you can see that some items at baseline people tend to agree with, and some items people tend to feel more positive about, rather, and some items people tend to feel more negative about. So some of these are reverse coded in that the question was asked negatively, but we've reverse coded it so that, you know, a 1 it expresses a positive attitude. So you can see that, for instance, there are places to walk to, such as shops, restaurants, and leisure facilities. Generally, people agreed with that, which is good. You know, if you want people to walk or cycle more, then generally you want there to be stuff for them to walk to, walk or cycle to. A lot of the walking items, you know, were reasonably positively answered. On the other hand, the 4 cycling items generally were less positively answered. And in particular, my local area is safe for an 8-year-old child to cycle. People generally disagreed with that. Similarly, cycling is unsafe because of the traffic. People tended to agree with that, you know, because it's reverse coded. You can see that at the bottom there. So yeah, we could see some differences at baseline in terms of these different items, whether people thought things were good or not. Okay, so the survey sample before going into some of the headline results. So we managed to recruit around 3,300, 3,400 at baseline. We were trying to have a split between the mini-Holland borough. This is across the whole of Outer London, because obviously to get a control group, so our non-mini-Holland boroughs are the other Outer London boroughs that aren't Waltham Forest, Kingston or Enfield. We had a roughly even split between mini-Holland boroughs and non-mini-Holland boroughs. Now, that, initially we thought perhaps the mini-Holland boroughs, when we were first thinking about the survey, that the mini-Holland boroughs would be our intervention group. But, an intervention programme over 5 or 6 years, by the end of it, frankly, there are large parts of the boroughs that haven't had intervention. So it's not like everybody in the borough has had an intervention. So we ended up using different kind of definitions of intervention groups, and particularly important was actually living close to an intervention, actually a scheme that has gone in. So basically our intervention sample is not as big as this makes it sound, which gave us sometimes power issues. But yeah, baseline 3,300, 3,400, generally just under half that responding in subsequent waves, not always the same half. So between 1,400 and 1,650 or so responding year on year for the whole sample. This image just gives you a sense of the different intervention groups that we were using. So this is from a paper that we published in 2019 at after wave 3. So the blue colours boroughs are the control group, the rest of Outer London boroughs, and the yellow are what we called our high dose areas. So each autumn, generally, we asked our stakeholders, we asked the 3 borough officers in the mini-Holland boroughs to draw on a map where they thought the high dose area would be in the following May, June, when we were conducting the survey. So basically, we asked them to draw an area where by the following May, June, if the interventions had the impact they hoped, this would be the residents, this would be the area where they would expect travel behaviour to change. So you can see that in Waltham Forest, sort of top right, you can see that a large part of the south of the borough is covered by a high dose area, and that is largely due to low traffic neighbourhood type interventions, area-based interventions. On the other hand, next door is Enfield, and you can see their high dose area is a W shape, and the reason for that is they've primarily at that point done route-based infrastructure, so their high dose area is sort of surrounding the routes. You can also see hopefully that there's some lines which are routes, so we also did a more traditional distance from route based analysis, and that also that provided similar results to what I'll present, but less strong, indicating that the area level analysis was actually better capturing what was going on. By contrast, the red are the low dose areas, so that's part of the 3 boroughs where at that time point no interventions had happened nearby. So, you're living in a mini-Holland borough, but you haven't actually got any mini-Holland action near you. Just a sense of what that meant. So these are pictures from Waltham Forest, a couple of types of intervention. At the top, you've got a major new corridor while it was being built, cycling and walking infrastructure along Lea Bridge Road and A Road. On the bottom, you can see a before and after. So this is a high street called Orford Road within a wider area-based scheme. So this was actually the first village scheme, as they were called. We might now say low traffic neighbourhood perhaps, but basically a chunk of the south of the borough in Walthamstow where they removed through motor traffic or substantially restricted it from a lot of streets, including this high street, Orford Road, where motor traffic was, I think, removed completely in one direction and largely removed for a chunk of the day in the other direction. This is a more sort of prosaic intervention. Just Waltham Forest did a lot of these within these area-based schemes. This is Black Horse Village, as it was called then, a before and after. So the before, a fairly traditional junction in a residential area. You've got tactile paving and raised and a raised table at least, but fairly traditional car parking and so on. And on the right, you can see that they've removed through motor traffic from that arm there, and that they've put in greening. You can walk or cycle through. There's some cycle parking, planting and so on, and there's a bench just out of shot, I think. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, sort of nice greening elements and substantial change in terms of motor traffic access, to motor traffic throughput rather, you can still access. So I'll just talk through this to explain, then there's a couple more of these. So this is our headline finding in terms of amount of active travel for all waves. Now, when we've gone through and done the analysis for the final report, we've separated out people who live in a low traffic neighbourhood from people who don't. So the high dose LTM generally means people who are living in an area that has had the most intensive intervention. They live in an area that has had this through motor traffic removed or very substantially reduced, and they're generally near some other active travel infrastructure as well, like a new cycle route, as part of this area, this high dose definition. The orange bar next to them is people who live in an intervention area, but it's less intense. They're not within a low traffic neighbourhood, but they probably live near a new cycling or walking route. They live in an area where stuff, or near where stuff has happened. And the blue bars are the low dose areas. So that's the people who live maybe in the north of Waltham Forest, in parts of Kingston where nothing really has changed, or Enfield where nothing really has happened. They're in a mini-Holland borough, but they're not getting the interventions. And I think you can see quite an interesting and clear picture here, which is that in the low dose areas, these are 95% confidence intervals. You can't see any clear evidence of change. In the high dose LTN areas, there is a substantial change in terms of the amount of active travel, walking, cycling, although the confidence intervals are generally large because the sample size in those areas is around 60 to 100, 110 people, quite small. And the high dose non-LTN areas are in between. So we seem to be seeing a clear dose response effect, where the more interventions, the more impact, and no interventions, even in a mini-Holland borough, doesn't seem to have an impact. Cycling participation, which was relatively low at baseline, as you can imagine, shows a kind of related pattern in that there's no really clear evidence of cycling participation in the low dose areas. The clearest evidence of cycling participation is in the high dose, low traffic neighbourhood areas, where we're getting generally around sort of 50% increase in the likelihood of past week cycling in those areas. So this is always compared to the control group of other outer London boroughs. So in relative terms, that's quite substantial, a 50% increase in the chance of cycling in the past week. On the other hand, just reminding you again that that's kind of in absolute terms, that's not massive because levels of cycling are relatively low at baseline, but nevertheless, it is a substantial relative increase. Amount of walking. So just to highlight that most of the extra active travel in terms of absolute minutes is walking. People are walking more. There's not necessarily great evidence of an increase in walking participation, although there is some evidence because a lot of people are already walking. But the amount of extra walking you can see in the high dose LTN areas is that's statistically significant in 4 of 5 waves. And we're getting people reporting around an extra 50, 60, 70, even more minutes of past week walking in those high dose LTN areas. Some evidence of increased walking also in the high dose non-LTN areas, but really, again, not that much going on in the low dose areas. Car use, there's the evidence here is weaker past week car use, partly because there's new walking cycling, but only some of it is coming from car use. Quite a lot of it is just new additional walking, which is obviously good from a health perspective, but doesn't necessarily come directly from the car. You can see again that the high dose LTN areas are the ones where really there's some evidence. It's not super strong, but there is some evidence of reduced car use. In 3 out of the 5 waves in those high dose LTN areas, we're seeing around a 20% reduction in the percentage in past week car use. Finally, on the change in perception, so this is interesting and a little bit different. So what we found was that there was an improvement in perceptions of the local environment, but this was driven by change in cycling perceptions. So even though a lot of the increase in active travel came from walking, these schemes were perceived as cycling schemes, and that was where we saw the improvements. We didn't see consistent improvements in the other indicators. And what this chart is showing you is that there is a stronger impact again in the more intense intervention areas, but we're also seeing a change in the low dose areas, so that even in those areas that are not seeing a change in travel behaviour over this 5-year period of the survey, there's no evidence of change in travel behaviour, but people are noting, they are saying that their local area is better for cycling. So there's a change in attitudes there, but not a change in behaviour. But by contrast, in the places with interventions, there's a change in behaviour and in attitudes. So just to sum up with some key lessons, a lot more I could say, but don't have time. But firstly, for travel behaviour, it seems to be actual schemes that make a difference. Getting people walking, cycling and using the car less required actual schemes. Secondly, though, there's a mismatch between impacts and perceptions. So people were walking more, particularly, but these schemes were perceived as cycling schemes. And the attitudinal impacts were more diffuse. People were seeing an improvement in the cycling environment, who didn't necessarily live close to schemes. Schemes are controversial, didn't have time to present the evidence on this, but even at baseline, schemes were controversial. Across the mini-Holland boroughs, people knew about schemes and they were causing controversy, but we did find some evidence that this could decline over time, particularly in the more areas with more ambitious interventions. And finally, we also obviously we're researchers, we think monitoring and evaluation are crucial. This provides us with evidence around increase in walking, which otherwise was not really being measured. There was some cycle counts, there was other research going on, but in terms of being able to measure a change in walking related to these schemes, that was really critical. And I was really pleased that we were able to look for that, and very interested in what we found. Thank you very much.